Hare Krishna Yogeshwar Prabhu. Welcome back once again to the Monks podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be back with you. Thank you very much.
Yes. So Prabhu, today I thought we could discuss on a theme that we had addressed briefly in our previous podcast about the extent the limits of technology, not just the moral limits of technology, not just in what some technology can do, but what technology should or should not do when technology starts playing God. So now this comes up from various directions, but one key direction is at this point there are attempts, say for example, to decide when life should begin or when life should end. So not just when but how. Like there are that ideas of designer babies, and that is associated with eugenics, which was which had quite a horrendous connotation during the Nazi history. And there's the idea also of assisted ending of life, you could say. But when is that legal? When is that desirable? When is that not desirable? I've read in Germany they have made it like a fundamental right for a person to die. So earlier it was only when a person has a terminal disease and it's incurable, then they can die. But here now the rule is that if a person desires to end their life, they see a psychologist, and if they say that yes, this person has a desire to end their life, and then the same government which is devoting resources to prevent suicide and now also provides resources to a person who is perfectly healthy otherwise to end their life. So where exactly do we draw the limits for technology, and what do our Bhakti texts say about this? It's a big issue, but maybe you can start with how you would like to address it, and then we can take it forward.
I agreed to discuss this topic with you, Prabhu, not because I'm a scientist. I know about as much as technology as you know about belly dancing. I'm not a scientist.
Yes, but I fully agree. I think this is sometimes I feel, sorry to interrupt you, but this is, I feel, a issue where it's not so much of we are discussing more not the technicalities of science, but the scope of science.
Correct.
Because there is science and there is scientism, which places almost an aura of omniscience around science.
Right.
So, yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
But that said, I mean, to have this conversation, we do need to put science and technology into some context. Otherwise, we won't be starting from the same point of origination. So some discussion about it is necessary. But I think the value of this discussion, as you've intimated here, is that it does concern us as devotees, as concerned citizens of a broader world. We move forward in our devotional life, not moved by neurological systems, but by ethical and moral and spiritual systems. And the implications, as you've been indicating, for that larger society with respect to technology and what it can do and what it should be allowed to do are quite dramatic, and they do concern us. This is my point. You can say, well, that's not our business. Within the devotee community, our business is, strictly Krishna consciousness and the fundamentals of devotional service. And these issues, whether they be politics or technology, whatever it may be, those don't concern us. Well, I disagree. I think they do. I mean, why did the acharyas bother writing books if they did not have a view toward the future of humanity? So
beautiful thought.
We have to have some concern, because if technology runs away from us, what kind of future will there be? So what is our responsibility toward the future, not just ourselves of today, but also the implications of the developments within technology for tomorrow. So there are a number of issues like this that deserve our attention. But for the sake of sharing a starting point of information with your listeners, your viewers, why don't we just put this in some context that, this is technology is not new. I mean,
Okay.
Leonardo designing flying machines back in the 1480s when Mahaprabhu first appeared on the planet. So it's not a new idea. But coming closer, if you go to, let's say, World War II and the dawn of the atomic age, 1945, now what we see is this giant leap in technology where anthropocentric intervention, human intervention, can affect the future of things through our technology. It may be, for example, that the future of Kali Yuga, as it's described in Srimad Bhagavatam, will not be an Adi Daivik result effect. It may be Adibotic. It may be anthropocentric. It may be that we ourselves will be the cause of the kind of description of this apocalyptic future in Kali Yuga that we read about in Bhagavatam. That's not made clear from the text. But it is, I believe, a possibility. We're seeing already the deterioration in environment and in climate and so on has a human point of origin. And so there is, I believe, this broader context for our conversation. That's an important one. And I do believe that it concerns us as devotees. So that's, I think, a good starting point for us in this.
Okay.
In this
Yes, true. So I like this point, especially that the Acharyas wrote books for the future, because in one sense, they had a reach at that particular time and through the oral tradition. But books are for posterity. So what, if I understand what you're saying, is that a broader concern beyond what immediately concerns us is an intrinsic characteristic of our tradition. So so that broader concern can be in terms of the society, broader human society at present. It can be the human society in the future, and eventually, even if we stay aloof from some of these technological advancements, but they will intrude into our lives sooner or later, because we as a devotee community are not living entirely isolated from the world. We are not an insular community in that sense. So I appreciate this point of, because it concerns us and so it both ways it will intrude into our life, and a part of our tradition is to show the relevance of our tradition to, say, contemporary and futuristic issues. So I think both perspectives are important. Now, I thought of broadly three things, that there are three categories of, say, as you say, anthropocentric or human intervention. So there are some things which are constructive, some things which are destructive, and some things which are more ambiguous. Now, of course, the constructive things may also have some destructive consequences. Say, for example, when we started using automobiles, we didn't really think that it was going to lead to climate change. But there are some things which are broadly, we can say, constructive. Having electricity, air conditioning, and say some kind of temperature regulation that helps us to survive in extreme weather conditions. So that's, we could say, some things are broadly constructive. So in that sense also, we are intervening with nature, but in a way that is broadly helping humanity. So is that also playing God? And is it playing it in the constructive? Is it playing it in a healthy way? Then there's something which is destructive. Say, for example, as you mentioned, weapons of mass destruction. Now, sometimes the destructive may also have some positive results. in the sense that now many parts of the world are trying to use nuclear energy, and relatively speaking, they say it is more eco-friendly than fossil fuels and others. Of course, to categorize when nuclear energy is being used for peaceful and violent purposes, that may not be that easy. But the point is that, so in principle, when we start using technology to try to modify the world around us, hmm, is that itself undesirable, or is it the way it is used, the extent to which it is used, that's what makes it undesirable?
I think the question is slightly misleading. The the situation here is that this is inevitable. Whether we think it's morally, ethically justified, whether we've gone too far or not too far, the reality is it's here and it's real. And the question is, how are we going to deal with it? The challenge is that it's not the technology, it's the culture around the technology. Now, we've allowed ourselves, from a scientific perspective, to outstrip our evolution morally and spiritually. We've started from certain assumptions. The assumptions are that more is better, fast is better, deeper is better, farther is better. And it's because of, if you take a step back, the image we have of ourselves as living beings. If the image you have of yourself as a living being is that this life is what I have, therefore let me maximize the utility, the happiness, the pleasures of this life, all the effort is going to be geared toward that utilitarian goal, optimizing those goals. In fact, part of the issue in artificial intelligence, for example, the big challenge when you go into broadening from the specificity of artificial intelligence, which is much more limited, to artificial general intelligence, which where it really begins to imitate brain functions, is what's called the problem of alignment. The alignment issue is, how do you align machines with the human notions of greatest good? You know, the risks that you see, Hollywood, of course, exaggerates this. When machines override their own limiting functions and rules because they decide that if I'm going to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, I have to kill this person. I have to kill that person. I have to take over this country. I have to drop this atomic bomb. So there's different scenarios where the AGI, artificial general intelligence, outstrips the restraints that human beings have imposed on them. If we take a step back, and this is, of course, the great contribution of Krishna consciousness, of the acharyas, of our Guru Varga, of Shastra, is that we know we're not, this one lifetime is not everything. This lifetime is a blip. It's one frame in this extremely long film strip of lifetimes. Now we have something that can guide our efforts, theoretically. So we have a great responsibility. This is why I say this is an important conversation, because what it does is expand the dialogue around the mission of Krishna consciousness in the world, away from the specificity of what we have known as identifiable devotional service, worshiping the deity, book distribution, 16 rounds, studying scripture, chanting the holy names, prasadam. These are all the basics. They always have to be there. But that cannot be the extent of Prabhupada's mission. He didn't come here just to create monastic cells. He came to create a spiritual revolution in society. And that spiritual revolution is not anti-technological. It's anti-material. Anything can be used in devotional service. I mean, that was the great contribution of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, He wore watches, traveled in cars, and sannyasis overseas, broke all of those
Hmm.
old traditions with technology in the service of Krishna. This is Rupa Goswami's Yukta Vairagya. We have no problem with technology. But what is the ethos that guides the use of that technology, the development of that technology, the deployment of that technology? That's where Krishna consciousness has a role to play.
Hmm. In one, I appreciate this point that before we get into specifics issues, the culture around technology, that's a very important point, and the ethos. So now, but that itself brings us to, so are we discussing this from a devotional perspective or for devotees? Because there is a starting presumption that this life is just one life, and or whether this life is as one phase over a multi-life journey. So we could say that this is like a axiomatic truth that we accept, that this is what our tradition's wisdom brings in. Because if that premise itself is not acceptable to the technologically infatuated mind, or not, I don't want to use the infatuated negative sense, but if that premise itself is not acceptable to most people in society today, then to what extent can we engage with and contribute to that discussion?
In other words, let me see if I can rephrase your question. If people don't embrace the Krishna conscious point of view, do we still have something to offer them with regard to limits or not of technology? Am I understanding your question?
Yeah, I would say the Krishna conscious point of view has many aspects, but the understanding of the self as going through multiple lifetimes. So I would say that in Krishna conscious perspective, there is ultimately Krishna is God, the all attractive vision of God. If we consider like a pyramid, the idea that a bluish black cowherd boy is God, that is a little more difficult for people to accept. The idea that there is essential self that goes over multiple lifetimes, that may have a little broader acceptance. The idea, even broader, we can say that life has a spiritual, life needs to have a spiritual purpose, or life needs to have meaning, which comes primarily from, say, ethical and spiritual side. That we could say have a much more broader acceptance.
Yeah.
So
Okay. I see. Look, I mean, it essentially you're asking what are the arguments that will be most compelling for getting people to reflect on the appropriate and inappropriate uses of technology. Right? In a sense, I think you're asking a question. Where people will be most responsive is when it affects them personally.
yes.
So, you go like 1995, for example, in Australia, there was an inadvertent unleashing of a virus that killed something like 30 million rabbits, from a laboratory. The pandemic we're confronting today, if people think that it's threatening, it's life threatening, well, they're more likely to pay attention than if it's just a theoretical issue about whether there's a self that transcends death.
Okay.
So that's understood, but it may be that look, Hollywood doesn't help, right? The Terminator image of cyborg soldier armies and these kind of human machine hybrids that
Yeah, Star Wars is filled with that, Star Trek has it, and then
sure,
they almost have almost entirely human characteristics, but they are largely science fantasy,
of
science
course,
fiction.
or movies like Her with Joaquin Phoenix or Ex Machina, and I mean, first of all, they get the science totally wrong. They're ridiculous from that perspective. But they're movies, right? So they're engaging and they raise certain issues for discussion. So it, ironically, it may just be that the technology of entertainment is an effective entry point for discussion about the higher issues of technology,
Okay.
because it's entertaining. People are aware of issues not because they've studied the implications from an ecological, environmental perspective, but because they saw a movie or a television show, and they go, "Oh yeah, I remember that
Yeah.
was interesting. Sure, let's talk about that." So, in that sense, that may be a way in for people. And when the Matrix came out,
Yeah. Matrix
I
was,
mean,
there were a
yeah,
lot of, I think, a lot of relevant things in Matrix as compared
yeah,
to,
sure.
yeah.
The whole idea that we're asleep, in a kind of material machine, and that if we wake up to our true self and so on. I don't know where the Wachowski brothers got all their ideas, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were reading something from the Vedas. And I remember, for example, even before I became a devotee, as an 18-year-old in 1968, when 2001 first appeared in movie houses, it was fascinating. The idea of a sentient machine, overriding human orders for its own notion of what is a more important goal or objective. I mean, it was extraordinary at the time. Today, you fall asleep. The movie's so slow, you can't watch it anymore.
Yeah.
But so, our own thinking has evolved over time. But the meta dialogue here, the larger dialogue, is important and can be made interesting. I think this is the best answer I can give you as we talk about this spontaneously. That's precisely our responsibility, isn't it? That's our job now, is to find a way to take Prabhupada's teachings, the traditional teachings, and evolve a new language, a new vocabulary, new phrasings, new wordings, new concepts, new modalities of expression, so that the essence of those teachings makes sense to a scientific and technologically oriented society. Which is why, for example, I was very honored recently when the people at the Bhaktivedanta Institute in Gainesville asked if I would join their board. I was felt very honored that the Bhaktivedanta Institute was arguably the most important project of Srila Prabhupada. He wanted to establish on scientific terminology, I can't say scientific grounds, but scientific terminology, that there is a relationship, that the Vedic perspective, the notion of a transcendent self and non-material self, consciousness, not as a product of material wave functions and particles, but as something of a different order altogether, is defensible. There's that famous walk on Venice Beach when he told his science disciples, our worship of Krishna, that's our own internal business. Your job is to present that consciousness is a non-material phenomenon. I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
So I think that's not only a great responsibility, but that's exciting. That's amazing that we have this opportunity. What an extraordinary thing. And we need to embrace it.
Beautiful. So broadly, what you are saying is that with respect to this dialogue, rather than first determining the limits of specific advances, so we can focus on as you said, what do we bring to this discussion? And what Prabhupada wanted us to is to take the message that he got from the tradition and see how it interacts with and how it addresses these issues. Yes, Prabhu. So, so if we accept the premise that, like as you said, consciousness is not simply a result of biochemical changes in the brain cells. So, if this understanding is there, how would that understanding mm, reflect uh, our technological pursuits, or how would that understanding shape technological pursuits?
Well, I'm going to answer you, but in an indirect way.
Okay.
Let's step back for a moment and look at where things are in, let's say, the world of artificial intelligence. Right now, you have most of the progress has been made in what's called narrow AI. Some people don't even like the term artificial. They say augmented intelligence. So it's called in different ways. But narrow AI is what most people are familiar with in your GPS and fast computations of very large numbers that excel the rate of determining how to get through masses of data, trillions of bits of data in super fast time. The more exciting area, I think, for most people working in this area is as we were discussing artificial general intelligence, where things become more spontaneous. I remember going to by the way, I do recommend to those of your listeners or viewers who are interested in the subject that they go to worldsciencefestival.com. My privilege is to have a very well-known brother, a physicist, Brian Greene, who has put together this extraordinary program called the World Science Festival. And if people are interested, there's thousands of recorded panel discussions and presentations and lectures. And all you have to do is in the search box, it's free. It's absolutely free. Just search for artificial intelligence or black holes or whatever the particular interest that you have. So worldsciencefestival.com, good place to go. I remember, however, going to one of the events of the World Science Festival, and there was a panel on stage, and it was mostly brain researchers. And they started, the subject of this panel was creativity and the brain. And they started with one of my heroes in the world of modern dance, Bill T. Jones, phenomenal choreographer. And Jones was invited to start this event by creating a spontaneous dance for 60 seconds. So there was a cello, and he stayed within a 1 foot square and without repeating a position. So he went through 60 seconds of totally spontaneous, beautiful gestures and movements. And then the panel discussion opened up, and they were showing projections of computer renderings of the brain when the brain has a creative idea. And then this part of the, Abdullah opens up, and this changes color over here. All kinds of. And Bill Jones is on stage. He's like this. He's obviously very worried. And then he speaks up. He says, I have a concern. My concern is that someday when we want to create a piece of music, when we want to create a dance, someone's going to sit down at a computer and they're going to knock something out, and that will be considered creativity. He says, for me, the only way I can describe for you the sensation, the fulfillment that I feel when I'm on stage and I dance is the word spiritual. And Prabhu, I have to tell you something. It was very embarrassing. What happened next was totally embarrassing. This panel of scientists did not even dignify him with a reply. They did not even bother to answer. They ignored him as if he wasn't there and had not said a word, and just went on with their whole discussion about this lights up and these neurons and it was so embarrassing. That now, of course, not all scientists are like that. I remember another panel discussion where it was a discussion about consciousness, And there were brain researchers from Columbia University and elsewhere. Unfortunately, one or two of them were rather conceited. And, one man who was very well known said, for hundreds of years, we've always said we have a brain. It's taken us this long to understand finally that we are the brain. And he goes on and on and on.
Oh my God.
And there was one person on that panel who was a philosopher. And he said, I just have to ask you something. Does it really diminish us so much to admit that our intelligence has not evolved to the point where we actually understand what consciousness is? Are we not able to actually admit that we truly don't know yet? And again, dismissed as though he didn't make a point worth considering. I walked out. I have to tell you. So there is a certain kind of conceit that arises in the science community because technology has been doing such phenomenal things. The rate of acceleration over the past 70, 80 years is extraordinary. It's amazing. I mean, look, I wear this Fitbit, There's more computational power in my Fitbit than in the entire NASA space operation that put Neil Armstrong on the moon, if you believe that we went to the moon. We're not going to get into that. But the entire 60s and 70s of the space program, there's more computational power in here. And most of that, the functioning of this watch is predicated on the behavior of electrons and subatomic particles that no one has ever seen. We have to be willing to admit that that's some pretty impressive stuff. And medicine, the developments in medicine. I mean, when devotees need an operation or they need medication to get healthy again, in those moments, we don't poo-poo science. I think we need to make this distinction between science and technology as viable tools that can be engaged in devotional service. And the mentality which says we don't need a God, we're capable of coming up with the answers to our problems on our own. That's the risky part there, is when this hubris develops, this egotism that because we can evolve these technologies, that is therefore evidence that there is no non-material causality in the world, that it's all possible within the realm of matter. The physicalist science perspective is the right one. That's dangerous. That's where you get all these, these man versus machine movies, and man comes up on top. Because the idea being that we have on our own the capabilities to overcome any hurdle, any obstacle, and that's dangerous in this.
Yes, true. I think that's a very significant difference between, say, using technology, accepting the utility and value of technology for our functional and our spiritual purposes, and then thinking that technology will lead to the denial or rejection, or using that technological advancement gives us the right to reject God. So there are very distinct differences. Having said that, in the domain of technology, in the domain of using technology, what comprises, say, playing God?
What comprises?
Playing God. Say, I read that, say, now we almost so many of us use glasses. So when glasses were developed for the first time, there were some religious teachers who said that you should not use them because you are interfering with the natural way, with the way nature goes through. So if nature is decreasing your eyesight, why interfere with nature? You have no right to interfere with nature. Now today we would consider that that absurd. But say in just a few, maybe a few hundred years ago, few 50 or 100 years ago, we didn't have so many facilities for CPR, where a person gets a cardiac arrest and person's heart stops working, and then we use so many techniques for restoring their life. So now that's why I said earlier, it's like this is constructive use. So if by the body's own functioning the life is ending, and then we use intervention to ensure that the body's life does that the body is still a usable instrument for the soul. So if that is a valid use of technology, and say if we move forward, when does the use of technology become questionable? As you said, that when do we start going from the role of using technology for, say, maintaining our survival or increasing our comfort in life, or at least decreasing our discomfort, to when we start using technology to usurping God or playing God? uh, that's where the question comes up, because it's a slippery slope. I mean, principle, even within our tradition, we had Ayurveda. So using means to enhance health or to cure disease, that is not at all anti-technology. That is not anti-spiritual at all. So earlier you said that things are that we are not anti-technological, we are anti-material, which is a very important point. But in terms of the deployment of technology, when does it change, or when does the purpose change, or is that something which is up to every individual's conscience
Well,
to responsibly decide?
technology and science do not have a moral compass. They do not
Yes,
have a spiritual or ethical compass.
yes,
They're
agreed.
meant to be neutral in that regard. They don't
Yes,
attempt, scientists don't attempt to take a position on the correctness or the incorrectness of the use of what they find. They say that's the realm of philosophers and religionists. That's not our business. Our business is to figure out how this works. So you know um, the we're in an experimental period because the technologies that are emerging are forcing us to ask questions. For example, you mentioned earlier eugenics, for example. Um, we we still have certain respect for life, for the sanctity of life. But when Nazi Germany, as you rightly mentioned, back in the 1930s and early 40s, instituted programs of euthanasia, of the murder of people with genetic challenges, mental illnesses of different kind. They pointed to the United States for their role model. The United States in the late 20s, early 30s sanctioned lobotomies, sterilizations, uh, other forms of violations of the dignity of life under the pretext of wanting to build a stronger, saner, safer society. And those programs were endorsed by very high-ranking people in science and government and education. And today, for example, in legal circles, there's a question about the introduction of artificial intelligence, AI systems into the criminal justice arena. When is due process of law compromised if evidence is being aggregated through AI systems and the specificity of a crime is lost within those data and statistics? We don't know the answers to these things. It's a time when men and women of goodwill, and we need to acknowledge it. You know, the world out there is not populated by, you know, rakshasas and rakshasis. It's not. Let's calm down a little bit about these things. The world is comprised of decent, for the most part, men and women and children who wish to go about their lives. You know, they're not looking to defeat God. They're not on some kind of political platform to prove the supremacy of science over religion or anything like that. There are some people who are strident and outspoken about these things, but for the most part, the world is filled with decent people who are looking for basically handle their responsibilities, take care of their children, have at least a minimum decent quality of life. And why am I bothering to say all this? Because in our discussion about technology and the relationship of devotional life to the constantly accelerating world around us, I think we need to recall that our primary obligation is to be good examples. So that when we talk about these things, whether it's, you know, the role of the relationship of Krishna consciousness in science, or the rights of women, people of other than binary sexual positions in society, or whether it's races and different communities, we're attempting to be Vaishnavas. We're attempting to offer all respect to others. How are we ever going to make advancement ourselves if we think ourselves better than anybody else? I don't see how that's possible. I remember Srila Prabhupada once, a young man came to him with an idea. And he said, Srila Prabhupada, I have an idea for a book, and I want to call the book 108 Steps to Krishna Consciousness. Prabhupada hated the idea. He said, no. Krishna consciousness is not mechanical like that.
That's interesting. I never knew that. So
you know, but that's a good, I think that's a good metaphor, a good equivalent for our conversation here about technology. The starting point for us is character. The starting point for us is respect. The starting point for us is a level-headed, dispassionate assessment of options and opportunities in service to the Supreme Lord.
okay. So I mean, I appreciate what you have spoken, and I love this point about not like seeking simplistic, like reducing spirituality down to simplistic steps. So spiritual wisdom, it is like we'll have to have a deep discussion or dialogue between how our spirituality can affect us and our use of the resources in the world, including technology. But say if we take specific issues, is there any, so I'll keep the discussion a little more open-ended, because I'm realizing that uh, focus, like questions which are too focused on particular issues may elude quick answers. So would you like to take any particular issue and to illustrate, how we can contribute based on our tradition something to the discussion around the culture, discussion about the ethos and culture of using technology?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it earlier, Prabhu, and it's what I think we would, what's called in the intelligence field, unaligned intelligence. You know, when the purposes of technology are not aligned with essential human values. I mean, the people involved in these worlds are all warning us about it. The Bill Gateses and the Elon Musk's. Stephen Hawking once described that artificial intelligence is either the best of humanity or the worst of humanity. We're in a position where this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to introduce guidelines for the future of science and technology. That's why I joined the BI board. I think it's critically important that somebody who's going to do it, who's going to offer those guys. I mean, yeah, there are departments in laboratories and in universities of called ethical intelligence. There are officers whose job it is to assess whether the applications of technology, even our god brother Brahmatirtha Prabhu in Gainesville, his job is to assess if an industry wishes to come into an area, what will their environmental impact be? And his report will very often determine whether a company is given a license to build factories or not build factories. So, there are opportunities that we have if we ourselves are clear. And I think this is the point. There's an education. That's what we know. It's been since Srila Prabhupada came to America now. It's been how many years now? And we're at a very exciting time, very, very exciting time, where we're, the temples are there, the structures are there, the books are there, the infrastructure is evolving, the foundational tools are coming into place, the safeguards, child protection, whatever it may be. We have an opportunity now to go deeper. And I think this is what Prabhupada always wanted us to do, to penetrate deeper into the issues of society so that we can contribute something unique from our perspective. It has to do with the nature of consciousness, which you and I have talked about before. But with regard to this issue of the future of technology and what are the limits, where does something become counterproductive? Where does it become dangerous? The issue is who will offer that education so that those people who are involved in these fields have moorings, have a structure, have a background architecture, an ethical and moral and spiritual architecture to work within. That, I think, is the challenge in front of us. But the technology is undeniable. Look, my son is an airlines pilot. 95% of the time that is in the air, his plane is on autopilot. So, I mean, whenever someone wants to go out on Harinam Sankirtan, they consult their GPS. What's the best route to get? It's a part of our lives. It's not an irrelevant discussion. But what you're asking, I think, is much more future oriented. You're saying, what are the limits? How do we know those limits? And I'm not sure that the answer lies within the technology itself. It's in the technology reflects its engineers. We have to remember this. Technology is dumb. Artificial intelligence is not very intelligent. It's dumb.
Yeah.
And the best that it can do is reflect the presets of its own engineers and designers. If you have engineers and designers who have been grounded in a spiritual education, in the wider context of what are the ultimate benefits of humanity, then we won't have to worry about the future of technology. The people working in those fields will monitor themselves. That's, I believe, where Srila Prabhupada's mission comes in.
Yes, Prabhu. Yeah, of course, it's quite clear that technology doesn't have the answers to how technology is to be used. Einstein famously said that we can talk about the We can talk about the ethical foundations of science. We cannot talk about the scientific foundation of ethics. So that's very clear. So what, if I understand right, what you are saying is that, say, if this is a particular technology and we are going to use it, so rather than we specifically stating how the technology should be used or not used, we create a system or a structure for informing those who are developing and deploying the technology, and then they will be able to they will be able to have more ethically responsible usage of the technology.
Well, yes, theoretically, that could be the program. It would require, if I may, devotees trained in these fields. I'm a layman. You and I can have this conversation because I'm not attempting to represent the technology industry or the scientific establishment. I have no degrees in any of that. But what I do know from my field is that, for instance, Nazi Germany took their prisoner population counts inside the concentration camps using an early generation of IBM computers. People may not be aware of that. But the background to the Holocaust was scientifically designed, technologically executed.
Yes, that's
so. We assume, those of us here in America, that democracy is always going to be there. We're accustomed to it. It's around us, and so on and so forth. And that technology will always be contained within this frame of reference. Nazi Germany proved totally otherwise. So, this isn't just theory. This is historically proven that without that moral compass, without that spiritual compass, it can lead to the most devastating of conclusions. So it's a serious subject, and I believe we are seeing some good signs now within ISKCON, within the Vaishnava community, that people are beginning to take stock of the kind of a contribution we can make in these larger arenas.
beautiful. So when you say that you are seeing the signs, are you seeing the signs within our movement, or you're seeing the signs, so our movement wanting to engage with these issues, or you're also seeing signs within the mainstream world that they are becoming more open to insights from spiritual traditions? Because the example that you gave earlier seemed to be they were quite dismissive about the idea of any spiritual inputs. So
I don't think it's filtered down to a temple level yet. In education, there are two things. It's called the systems level, and then there's the buildings level. Systems level means an educational program that's implemented across a whole state, for example. Building level means that there is ancillary materials that each teacher in each building gets to choose. I don't think that this kind of a discussion is filtered down to the building level, if you will, the temple level within our society. When Sariputta was living in Gainesville, there was some of this going on there. Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj, of course, always spoke about this in his classes. But it's still pretty much limited to the various Bhaktivedanta institutes around the world. The good news is that there's a growing community of devotee scientists. And there's an initiative, one of the many initiatives that the BI in Gainesville has implemented, of outreach to devotee scientists around the world. So there's a kind of network that's beginning. And little by little, you have these networks forming into colonies or unions of like-minded people in a certain field. So we have physicians, devotee physicians, who are beginning to organize themselves. We have devotees working in chemistry, devotee scientists working in cosmology. So these clusters are beginning to form and grow and beginning to develop a kind of internal synergy. among themselves. So that's critically important, and that needs to be encouraged. Um, it's not yet on a systemic level, I think, institution wide. We're still at a point where the institution is having to deal with the basics of protecting Prabhupada society, making sure that there are controls in place, financial and behavioral and so on. So we're, even though we're 60 some odd years into this, going deeper into the areas that you always bring up. Your programs are phenomenal. Those have to happen on the level of the congregation. If you look historically, the inroads that have been made by religious communities rarely get implemented by the clergy. The clergy are responsible for safeguarding the institution. They have to make sure that liberals like me don't rock the boat too much, and that the best practices from the past are being maintained and perpetuated. When you look for innovation, you look to the congregants. They have the liberty, the option, the opportunity, and the impetus to bring fresh blood, fresh ideas, fresh energies into the community. So I think that's where we're going to see it.
True. I mean, it is very striking that in general, if we consider our whole tradition, reform has happened more at the sidelines than at the center. Bhaktivinoda Thakur himself was not like a central part of the Gaudiya tradition. He was not born in it. He was not even initiated when he discovered the Gaudiya tradition. And it was he who brought in the dialogue with the Bhadraloka. And in one sense, he created a new future, a new trajectory into the future for our tradition. So Prabhupada is also not like a central leader in the Gaudiya Math. And he, in one sense, now of course, around him a whole tradition has been built. But so what you are saying is that it will be more individual devotees who may form say, so I don't know if sister organizations or associated forums, what would be the right word, but they may come together and create some formal or informal structures. And then there will be this dialogue that will happen, this interaction that will happen at a broader level.
Yes. If there are devotee scientists out there among your listeners, viewers, I would encourage them to reach out to the BIHS, Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies in Gainesville, find out more about what they're doing, learn about the people working in your field with whom you can connect, and maybe develop your own synergy. And don't wait for somebody upstairs to bless your effort. Just go do it. Just go do it. Just go take the initiative to get something started. That's how things move forward. Prabhupada didn't wait for someone to say, okay, now you just go do it. And of course, take advice from the senior devotee community. You can never go wrong with that. But where each of us called upon to issue, to engage with our own initiative in a life of devotion. And each of us has been given our particular skills, our particular field of knowledge, our particular sphere of influence. And our job now is to go out and to make the most of those opportunities.
That's amazing. So in one sense, this is more of a how the right word for it, deinstitutionalized or individualized application. So for example, just I work with the Bhaktivedanta Hospital doctors, and they were discussing. They had a few of the devotee leaders from Radha Gopinath community. We had a virtual meeting on discussing what should be the policy if somebody wants to, if they're not able to have a child, then can they use IVF? What all things can be done, what all things cannot be done? Sometimes in IVF, the embryos are created and they're harvested, and if one works, then the others are destroyed. So is that acceptable? So these kind of issues, now I tried to give some inputs, and other devotees also give some inputs. So there were the three things which I thought of at that time. One is that this requires both spiritual expertise and technical expertise, and there has to be a deeper understanding of the issue based on a deep, serious discussion on this. And then after that, also, when an understanding is arrived, would there be like one universal understanding for the whole movement? Would we have, say, in future, committees that our movement appoints, maybe the GBC appoints, and they say that this is our stand on this issue? Now, for some issues, maybe say consider abortion, we may, the moral ambiguity might not be there so much. Although in terms of sociological context, certain factors may need to be considered. But so, are you saying that the positions, once the individuals take initiative and then they engage into the dialogue, then eventually there will be institutional positions on these issues, or that is something which may or may not happen?
Oh boy. I guess I should know better than to expect an easy ride when I come going someplace with you in these conversations.
Sorry about that.
You know, uh, ultimately, our relationship with the Supreme Lord is a very personal one. And I grow concerned when I think about institutions or governments um, trying to infiltrate too deeply into an individual's private life. My concern there is that it's very easy to cross the line into totalitarianism, authoritarianism, dictatorships, and the risk there is to strip away the very nature of devotional service itself, which is a free offering of love from the heart. So I grew very concerned, when we enter into this particular territory about should there be institutional locked in stone guidelines. I don't know whether it's even possible. Certain basic ideas, perhaps, of course, always have to be there. The foundations of our philosophy are inviolable. But are they without exception? I can't tell you that today. I cannot say to you that everything is so absolute that it does not allow room for some exception. I think we have seen over the course of history, over the course of several hundred years, that Gaudiya Vaishnavism has proven itself flexible, has proven itself adaptable according to the changing circumstances of the culture around us. I used to have an office in the Empire State Building here in New York. The Empire on the 52nd floor. And in a strong wind, you could actually feel the building swaying.
Really?
The reason is the architects, when they first designed the Empire State Building, recognized that if the steel pilings they used to support the core of the building were too rigid, that in a strong wind they would snap and the building would collapse. So there was built into the amalgam of materials a certain degree of flexibility in order to avoid that kind of risk. The same is true within institutions. If you become too rigid, it'll snap. There has to be some degree of flexibility in order to allow for diverse populations, in order to allow for shifting circumstances, changing issues and usages over time. That's also there in law also. Law is codified, but then law can evolve. Courts can evolve in their thinking. Everything evolves. That's the nature of progress. It's something that's in constant motion. So I'd be very careful. I'd be very wary of arbitrary, locked in stone. Truth is, I don't get into trouble here. Truth is not a set of tablets passed down from on high without change. Truth is a living, breathing experience that has many different dimensions to it. And I believe devotional character means being able to take a deep breath, step back away from our own convictions about something far enough to be able to consider that maybe other people have a different perspective from mine, and it does not make them wrong. If we're ever going to see a strong, healthy, Krishna conscious culture making its greatest contribution in the world, Prabhu, I don't think it's going to be by people insisting that we are right and other people are wrong. I don't think that's the way it's going to happen. I think it will happen by a maturing on our part, that we were able to accept that my conviction is my conviction, and now I'm willing to step outside the parameters of my conviction far enough to listen with open ears to what other people have to say, because they have their covenant with God just as I have my covenant with God.
Beautiful. And this, when you think saying this about truth is a living, breathing experience, at one level, it is the truth is not just a handed down set of. Was it your tablets you used in the Old
Well,
Testament? Yeah, I
I
know.
mean, that's not so oblique reference to the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, Ten Commandments. Moses came down from the mountain. Yeah,
The good news, of course, is that the commandments are infinitely uh, uh, um, uh, uh, unfolding.
yeah,
They have many
unfoldable. Yeah.
dimensions to it. But that it was a metaphor.
No, no,
Just
I
a
agree with
metaphor.
you. Now, in our tradition also, we have this principle that Prabhupada quoted Dharmam to Bhagavad Pranitam, Dharmam to Sakshat Bhagavad Pranitam. But then that Dharma comes from God. But then also, Dharma se Tattvam Nihitam Guhayam. Mahajanoyana Gata Sapanta. The Dharma resides in the hearts of the great souls. That it resides in the deepest recesses of the hearts. And how do we learn Dharma? By following in the footsteps of the great souls. So in that sense, that dynamic, that there is, as you said, there are some inviolable fundamentals, but then it's not that all aspects of living in the world are locked in stone. So that dynamism is there within our tradition itself.
I'm
So
ready.
yeah,
Please.
yeah. So just to you can reflect that I was going to example of this, but maybe you can continue first respond to that point.
What you put me in mind of is what for me has been a guiding light in my own Krishna consciousness. And that is that there's a foundational dimension of Krishna consciousness which is comfortable. We adapt a personality as devotees. We adapt the neck beads, we adapt the clothing, we adapt the festivals and the holidays, and we identify ourselves with a cultural milieu that is familiar, reassuring. I think that when someone is ready to make some substantial progress in their spiritual life, you step outside that comfort zone. You enter into the more challenging issues, such as you are so good at raising in these podcasts, and you begin to exercise initiative so that you, as a unique, never to be duplicated, irreducible being with your own unique relationship with the Supreme Lord Shri Krishna, begin to discover what that means. You begin to discover what it means to exercise that uniqueness as a servant of God, because it's not a parroting of someone else's service. It's not simply doing what someone else is doing. It's very, very unique to each of us. And the only way we can come to know what is the nature of our unique love for God is by going out there and taking some risks, by stretching the envelope, by stepping outside our comfort zone and attempting to make that greater effort to do the one thing that is most pleasing to God, which is to bring knowledge of Him into the larger world.
Mm.
That's why that verse was that Yatamam Guyam, 18th chapter.
Yeah, edam,
You
yeah,
know,
edam paramam
that's
nad bhaktechu abhidhyasati. Yeah.
if I love you, I want to do the thing that is most pleasing to you. And here's Krishna saying, if you really want to please me, get up and get out there and I've got other children who are suffering out there. Go bring them back to me. So to do that, we have to understand what are our unique gifts, and that takes some effort. You can't do that staying at home all the time. Well, maybe these days, but
Okay.
my point is that it's not without risk. That's my point.
Yes, I agree fully. So that when we are offering, now we are all unique, that I have understood, but never to be duplicated personal relationship with Krishna. That makes us, that infuses us with a sense of, you could say, non-egoistic spiritual significance. Sometimes we say humility means we are insignificant, but at another level, bhakti means that we are so significant that we all have a relationship with the Lord. Each one of us has a personal relationship with the Lord. So now applying that, so maybe I'll just take one issue which may not be particularly controversial, but say nowadays artificial meat is being made, where without using any animal products, using say vegetable products, substance is made which looks like meat, which tastes like meat, and so would it be ethical or unethical to take that? Would it be devotionally? So should technology be used to make something like this? Now, the purpose of this may not be primarily spiritual, but it may be because there are people who are vegan and who there is that itself is a significant is uh, an indication of some evolution of higher consciousness. We are concerned about the life of about animals. So if we say opposite, now I'll try to give both perspectives on this. That ultimate one perspective would be that, if it tastes like meat, it looks like meat, then it's going to remind you of meat, and ultimately we don't want to eat meat, so why eat something which reminds us of that? That could be one way of looking at it. Why even encourage that? Why even support that? The another way of looking at it could be that we say that, you know yes, if people are not going to eat it, if we can stop the killing of animals by this, and if in this way less bad karma happens, then why not? And maybe it could act as a transition. So people who are eating meat, they stop eating meat by this, and then eventually they may become more, their consciousness may also become more receptive to spiritual truth. So of course there can be many more pros and cons. Somebody may say that we don't know what are the long-term health consequences of this, and we are tampering with nature, and we are unnecessarily getting into trouble. But so if two devotees, or two devotionally engaged devotees who are engaged in society, they come up with different perspectives. One says, "Don't eat this." Another says, or another says, "Don't eat it. I won't eat it, or I won't recommend people eating it." And somebody says, "I won't object to people eating it, and if situations force me, if situations constrain me where I have to, I will not. I'm not in principle opposed to eating it." So would both be broadly compatible with bhakti? Now I'm just taking a specific issue, but I'm just trying to see how this could be applied. If you would like to
Well,
take it.
I love that whenever we talk, you have very, very specific issues that you want to get into, and um, uh, very, practical level of application of our talks. And that's very important, of course. I don't think we're going to come to any kind of blanket conclusion here today about an issue such as this. Sure, I think you've laid out the various perspectives quite well. I mean, it may not be for a devotee, because after all, if it tastes like meat, why would you want to eat it anyway? But if it means that there will be less animal killing in society, and that people who still have the taste have an option, that they don't have to be involved in killing animals and so on. I mean, the important issue here is the discussion, isn't it? It's not the outcome, it's the process.
Really?
We're at a time when stimulating these kinds of discussions, we finally have a chance to do that. We're not, it's not 1968, 69, 70, 75, 80, 85. You know, we're 2021, and we're finally at a point where we can begin exercising these tools that we've been developing for things that have greater ramification, let's say, that can make a deeper impact on the wider culture. That's the important thing. So whether the discussion that you just outlined hypothetically concludes one way or the other, may be a question of what country you're in. You know, if you're in Argentina, where the number one industry is cow slaughter, that may be a different discussion than if you're in some place where you know, vegetarianism is more widespread. I don't know. That's very specific to the circumstances in which the discussion is taking place. The important thing is the discussion.
My God. So it's very significant. So what you're saying is, uh, in the 1960s, 70s, or even 80s, our purpose was more centered on conversion. Whereas, so that's why the outcome was important. But now our purpose is more of, say, entering into the conversation itself. And then in that sense, becoming a part of the broader discourse in the world. So, so the process itself is important. So are you saying this is because we as a movement have evolved, or is it because the world has changed and that conversion kind of outreach is not acceptable in today's world, or is it both?
I don't think people have changed all that much. We're reaching a more mature stage because we're getting older and grayer. You know, I used to be a redhead, not really, but the point is that we're getting older, and hopefully we're getting a little bit smarter, so that, you know, if we're not going to just be attracting hippies and dropouts anymore, and we really want to reach a more intellectual audience, we have to have a firmer grasp of the issues, and we have to be able to know how to engage in the dialogue about those issues. When people will take Krishna consciousness seriously is when they see that the exponents of Krishna consciousness have something intelligent to say. We're not going to, you don't trick people into becoming devotees. You know, that doesn't work.
We're not going to trick. What are the word you use? Trick or what?
Yeah, trick people, you know, to do something cunning that will force them to make a decision they didn't want to make, to move into a temple or to start chanting. You know, there may be some trickery, some in the early days of the movement, we used to do all kinds of crazy things to get people to take a book, because we had this conviction of they just touch the book, it'll help them, and so on and so forth. Well, that's all right. We made as many enemies as we did friends. Today, if we're going to make a significant contribution to an improvement, a spiritual reformation of the society, you can't do it by tricking people into buying a book. You have to be able to address issues. You have to be educated on those issues. You have to know what the themes are, what the challenges are. You have to be aware of the various solutions that are being proposed. And then when you're immersed in something, you can find what is that unique additional contribution that we can make through Krishna consciousness. That takes some effort. That's the opportunity that we have now.
This is a very amazing thought, because in the past I used to write frequently on for Back to Godhead magazine on the column called Vedic Observer, which address contemporary issues, and two of my books are on that theme, timeless wisdom on current issues and things like that. But then over a period of time, I started feeling that there is nothing definitive or conclusive that we are actually offering, because these are such complicated issues. And I can also say in 2005, I was much more, you could say, much more narrow minded or much more presumptuous about the scope of conclusiveness that we can offer to issues. Now, maybe some humility has come in, although there's much more. But then I started feeling that if we are not offering anything definitive, then what is the point of engaging in those issues? But what you are saying is that the purpose of engaging in these issues is not so much to give a definitive or conclusive understanding about that issue, but it is to enter into the discourse, and by that, say people's minds will open to what who we are and what we represent.
Now you're talking. Now you're talking. When we just get off our high horses, we know, you don't know, we're going to clue you in. And just start talking like normal human beings again. That, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? It's what you do in your podcast. You're open to a dialogue, right? And all of a sudden, we're approachable. Nobody can identify with someone who's so fixed in ultimate truth that, who wants to be with them? Look, we're sometimes so preoccupied with being ideal Vaishnavas that we forget to be warm-blooded human beings. The real preaching work, what's good preaching work? Become somebody's friend. Let them feel that they can trust you. That you're interesting to talk to. That you're actually concerned by them, their life. That's such a gift. That's such a gift, especially now. There are so many broken hearts out there. So many people suffering from loneliness. They could care less what your position is on technology and science and artificial meat. They could care less. But if you take the time to sit with them and say, how are you doing? Is there something that you need? And just to be warm and friendly, they'll never forget you. And then maybe one day they might even ask, what are those beads around you? What is this mad compulsion, to impose ourselves on people? I don't understand that. I don't understand it. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was here, yes, he was a great scholar. He won people over, not so much by sophisticated Shastric references, which he did do, Prakashananda Saraswati, Sarvabhauma, and others, but because of the love in his heart. People were so thrilled just to be with him. And he loved everyone. They felt that he cared for them. There was this totally smitten, total love of Mahaprabhu for the person he was. Prabhupada was the same way. Yes, he was strong and he was philosophical, but that's not the side of him that I remember so much. I remember this person he cared for me. He cared for everyone. He was humble. He was funny. You can love a human being. You can't love a philosophy. You can love a human being.
It's amazing. So, I mean, we have discussed this topic earlier about how the Prabhupada that captured the heart was the Prabhupada was loving. But I think bringing this issue, what you said about a mad compulsion to impose our view on others, for many years, I would say that was my definition of preaching.
Yes. We were all brought up that way, I mean, look, truth be told, Prabhupada was someone for everything. He wanted we're a missionary movement. Krishna consciousness is a missionary movement. There's no two ways about it. And there's nothing to be ashamed of in that at all. But it's more than just that kind of aggressive missionary quality. You can be a missionary and be very quiet, and very humble. Sometimes that's even more effective missionary work.
This is so true. And eventually, I think the the deepest conviction, maybe some initial positive impression might come because a person appears very confident and has all the answers. It might appeal to some people, but eventually it is how thoughtful, how caring a
Of
person is.
course.
That's what is going to lead to an enduring spiritual connection. True. So we could see there's discussion on these issues more as, so I want to go back to one point which I didn't address, that you said that the world is not filled with demons. The world is generally, again, there is this polarity of we and they, and I think that is maybe an artifact of the time when we were a much more insular movement. So when I started reading about really broadly outside our tradition, so I read one book by Houston Smith about world religions, and he said that, when we are exploring other religions, we start with two assumptions. He said people everywhere are essentially like you, and people want to get on with the business of life, and they turn to religion as a resource for getting on with the business of life. So I found that very striking, that, as you said, people want to take care of their family, have a job, be healthy, and go on with the business of life. So how do we reconcile this with the idea, say, that this Kali Yuga and most people are degraded, and there are divine nature and there's demoniac nature? So sometimes some devotees, not seen explicit quote, Prabhupada will say sometimes if somebody is not a devotee, that means they're all demons. So as I said, I have not read that quote. So the idea that people out there are not evil or bad people, this itself requires a certain amount of reconceptualization of Krishna consciousness. Because quite often in the initial days, there is a significant amount of fear that is created.
I have to tell you something, Prabhu, and I get into trouble when I talk like this. I know it, but I can't help myself. This image that people have of Srila Prabhupada as some kind of, someone with a sledgehammer in his hand, who's coming to smash demons, is the most harmful thing I think I can think of in our society. It's embarrassing, it's infuriating, and it's just plain wrong. There were times when Prabhupada was strong like that, and that was important. It was, part of a certain ethos that he brought to his mission. But he wasn't training us to become an army of disciplinarians. That's not why he came. It's very saddening for me, as someone who knew him and spent time with him, to think that people have this image. And I tell you truthfully, I think anyone who has this idea, this image of Prabhupada as, the strong, strict disciplinarian out there, to smash the demons, they have some serious psychological problems. They might want to consider getting some therapy. Because that note, how on earth are you ever going to bring someone to Krishna consciousness if all you see is a world full of demons? I like what Carl Jung once said. He said, what if the worst of the offenders, the person who is most in need of correction, what if those people are all in need? What if I am the one who is most in need of my own concern? What then? That's us out there. That's not some Rakshasa horde. That's you and me. before Prabhupada came. I would just ask people to reconsider that strident position because, frankly, I find it offensive.
This is one of the things which struck me when I read your book, Prabhu, that how you, Swami in a Strange Land, how you presented Prabhupada. It is also, I got a recent comment I was going to share with you. He says, one devotee shared with me, I feel I have fallen in love with Yogeshwar Prabhu's Prabhupada. I wish I had heard about this Prabhupada more than 10 years ago. So, this is beautiful. When I read, yes, I'll conclude with this point, and just to add to this point. When I read Radhanath Maharaj's Journey Home, he devotes one full chapter on Prabhupada's song, Markine Bhagavad Dharma. And he described that song and he describes his reflection on that song. And in terms of the whole book, there is so much adventure in the whole book, but this is just meditation on one song. So then it struck me. I had read that song many times, but that was the time when I found so much he has devoted on, so much space in that book has devoted on that one song, that the picture of Prabhupada we have in that song is, say, very different from the picture we might get from a book like Life Comes from Life, or a book like the Hare Krishna Challenge, or some other books like that. So that Prabhupada had so many different facets which can be so radically different. And what you said is that sometimes Prabhupada did that, but that was not Prabhupada most of the times. And Prabhupada's purpose was not to create an army of disciplinarians. That's quite I think for many devotees, it will be a significantly radical reconceptualization of who Prabhupada was. Because for many devotees, Prabhupada was like this, and occasionally he was, he was accommodating. That was like a license for some times. But this is who Prabhupada was really. But what you're saying is almost like flipping the narrative.
Well, better late than never.
Yes, true. So
I always enjoy my time with you. You challenge me. You challenge me to come.
I would say that. Yeah, I mean, it is. I really wish personally also that I had this dialogues maybe 10, 15 years ago. But probably I wouldn't have benefited as much from them at that time as I would have now. So I'm very grateful for this dialogue, Prabhu. And should I try to quickly summarize? I don't want to take too much of your time. We went over a lot of topics. So we try to discuss broadly is technological development playing God? Is developing technology equivalent to playing God? So rather than getting into specific issues, you focused on the point that we are not anti-science, we are not anti-technology. We have a whole philosophical underpinning for the use of technology, philosophical basis. What we are is anti-material. And when technology becomes, say,
excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would even adjust that somewhat. I don't think we're anti-material.
Yeah, that is true. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think we're looking to manage things in society so that the material and the spiritual can cohabit peacefully.
Oh, okay. So I think, maybe we could say not even anti-material, it could be anti-materialistic or anti-hedonistic.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you said that you gave the example of, was it the World Science Congress, where they were not ready to hear even can you hear about the idea of a non-material perspective for a trans-material perspective for the
World Science Festival. Yeah.
World Science Festival, yeah. So rather than focusing on specific issues, the core theme was the culture around technology. Because rather than thinking that is this good or it is bad, you said it is here and it is real and it's not going to go away. So how can we direct the discussion around it? So first point you made, it concerns us. Krishna consciousness is not just about identifiable devotional practices. I love that phrase, that such as chanting and deity worship, but it's also about how we engage with the world in Krishna's service. And so these issues are going to concern us primarily because they will infringe into our life sooner or later. And also because our acharyas themselves wrote books which indicates that they wanted to shape the future and engage with the broader world. And so that's what we should also be doing. And then, so the ethos with which technology is used, the culture around the use of technology. So how and why technology is developed and deployed. So we discussed how at one level, say, when in the Nazi Germany, the eugenics project developed, that was developed based on inspiration from America. And there have been horrendous misuses. We talked about Australia also. A pandemic happened at that time in 1985, there in 1985. So technology is real. And rather than thinking that this is irrelevant to us, that could be one extreme. The other is that we have some definitive answers and everybody simply has to hear those answers from us. We can use these issues to engage in the discussions. And so you got the example of how Bhaktivedanta Institute has now invited as one of the directors or advisors. What was that?
I was asked to join the board of directors.
The board of directors, yeah. So the idea is that we provide, those who are pioneers, those who are working in these fields, we provide them some overall direction based on, we become a resource for providing them that direction. And when we are engaging in this, the focus is not so much on the outcome as on the process. That by engaging in the discussion, we become a part of we get a place on the table, and then people get to know about us. So rather than trying to convert them to our definitive understanding, it is more that through our interactions, we get them to increase their receptivity and curiosity for Krishna consciousness. And one way of doing this also is that basically entering into the dialogue, we can go back to your point about, say, Hollywood movies which have sci-fi themes. Quite often, the science in them is they're not really scientific. They're too fantastic, but that can be a good discussion point to get people to consider, say, some more spiritual perspectives. We talked about augmented intelligence and then overall general intelligence or artificial general intelligence, which is much more elusive. Well, so then one very significant point when I raised the issue about, as we as a movement, will we have some positions on certain issues? You said it is more of, we don't want to become like a totalitarian institute because that's a danger. Rather, the truth is not just locked in stone, but truth is a living, breathing experience. So it's in the Mahajanoinagata, Dharma se tattvam nihitam guhayam. So if we can educate devotees and offer educational resources for the broader world, then individuals can come up to their own decisions. And that way, we will be empowering devotees and individuals to develop their relationship with Krishna and contribute in terms of their unique, non-duplicable relationship in this world. And then toward the end, you mentioned about how when we're trying to engage in a dialogue with people, we have a more humble and respectful attitude. Not that we have the answers and all of them are demons. Rather, that Prabhupada, if Prabhupada is portrayed like that, that is a misrepresentation of Prabhupada. Prabhupada he said, he was humble, he was loving. And what people care of is not so much our position on particular issues, but on who we are as human beings. Sometimes in trying to be ideal Vaishnavas, we forget to be normal human beings. And what people need in the world today is this. I loved the statement that the essence of preaching is actually to become somebody's friend, so that people see us as a trustworthy person whom they can open up to. And that way, we can have more, you could say, more deeper and sustainable transformation of the heart and reconnection of people with Krishna. You like to add any last words, Prabhu?
As always, you do an extraordinary job of summarizing a long, complex conversation. Thank you very much, Prabhu. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful talking with you. Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.